Hello, I'm Greg. Why not? I work in VFX post-production for a media and entertainment studio in Toronto. I've been a ZFS advocate for over a decade now. We use it in a full production in a previous job, and I came to this studio and I was pitching the idea that we use ZFS to do some of our projects. Is the incumbents that we've been using were Isilon and Cumulo. I just want to talk a little bit about my experience there, and um, these opinions are my own; they're not reflective of my company or whatever, that legal stuff. Anyways, we put together a ZFS system for a project that we started on about a year and a half ago. It was right now, as it is today, it's about 740 some terabytes in size, and that's on a 1 petabyte file system. Um, whilst the project went well and there was no significant issues, and we started thinking about can we actually use this in production, and we started reading the compliance compliancy audits that we'd have to adhere to. It turned out to be a bit of a show blocker, unfortunately, which was pretty sad because it was looking promising, and I was thinking I was breaking new ground in media and entertainment, but it didn't turn out that way. So the currently the native ZFS lacks built-in capabilities for doing file access level auditing, such as who opened the file, who modified it, who deleted it, who moved it, and the times and dates and the machine number that it came from. And these kind of metrics are ones that the auditors require. They're a prerequisite for being assigned a project for some of the big studios. Apple and Netflix come to mind. There's others. So those audit logs are crucial for compliance with the security standards. And there's many of them. The one that we're under predominantly is the TPN and the MPAA. And if you're not able to provide a concise, accurate accounting of who did what to what file and when, you could potentially and probably not get awarded that project as a result of that. So I poked around, but this is one of the things that I see as ZFS is a bit of a showstopper in my industry, plus others too, like financial and medical. They have similar requirements for auditing. And as Michael and the team had alluded to earlier in the conference, one of the problems I believe that we face is that this file system is available on multiple platforms. So with Linux, I was looking at Audited, but I couldn't figure out a way to make that work correctly with SMB and NFS. So that was a bit of a failed effort there on my part. But anyways, Cumulo and Isilon, they make this very easy. And I've showed I should have probably pasted a clip of the example of the logs that come out of Cumulo or Isilon, but anyone who's used those are familiar with what I'm talking about. They'll show you everything that you need to know. And it would be good if ZFS could implement that at some level. I don't know if the consensus is that's a higher level protocol issue to deal with, because I'm not sure how Cumulo and Isilon handle that themselves, because it's a proprietary closed system. So that was basically one of the things that I when I have my meetings with Michael and whatnot, that was like one of our roadblockers of recently that I discovered. And I guess I just want to bring up the talking point about seeing if that's something that's possible and how difficult that is, or just general thoughts on it.
Here's the issue with that I think our friend is having. The normal operating system audit functions go through syscalls. NFS does not. NFS goes directly into the VFS layer. unless you're using like some weirdo, user space NFS. And so there's no mechanism at present to say, hey, NFSD, please audit everything you do. And in fact, one of the problems with NFS as a protocol is that it doesn't traffic in file names at all. It has these weird opaque things called file handles that it hands around.
And I think, like you said, it goes directly into the VFS layer where it's like a vnode on the FreeBSD side. And so the kernel doesn't have a file name at that point either. And it's hard to create an audit log about who did what to a file when you don't know the file's name.
Right. Now, I think depending on your SMB implementation, you might have that information available there. But for NFS, it's just a really, really hard problem.
Well, I think even with SMB, you have the problem of the username is not the Unix username, it's the Windows domain username, which maybe is in a format where the audit system is going to see it, but maybe not as well.
If it's POSIX, you're good.
Yeah, but it's probably mostly domain /username. But yeah, the NFS and not having a file name easily is an extra tricky bit.
But
I was not aware that the MPAA was going to have those kind of audit requirements, but I suppose when you're talking about, attribution and credit for creating stuff and copyrights, it actually does make sense.
it's more of who viewed this, who could potentially leak it. That's the origination of the MPAA side of it.
Recall that North Korea owned Sony a few years back, and leaks happened, and people were cranky about leaks, and now they want to know through almost a remote session who is doing what to what image, how and when, and you name it. So that's the new MPAA Trusted Partner Network, and thank you, Greg, for your patience. Somehow Wi-Fi just went out to lunch. So key highlights, I guess, to recap for Greg. Again, always
The
at the
OS
higher
level auditing should provide most of this, but the problem is NFS is special and goes around the syscall auditing and goes directly into the VFS layer. And at that layer, it's all file handles and vnodes, and we don't know the file name of the file handle. And that makes things that much more complicated.
So do we need a mapping system around that can map it all the way to the file GUI all the way to the
Trouble is you'd have to do that in real time.
right.
Because obviously, file could be deleted or renamed and you wouldn't know.
That's
Yeah.
what VFS is doing for you
Yeah.
under the covers.
Well, when you, at the higher level, when you do the call, it maps the name to the vnode, but once you've done that, there's not an easy way to go backwards. Because, you can have a vnode that's open for a file that's been deleted. And so there is no file name for that file now, but you can still read and write the file until you close that handle.
And maintaining that state is something that needs to be recorded, to be audited.
Right, you could potentially have a auditable NFS implementation that kept a gigantic table of all the file handles that it's ever handed out and what paths led
Or
to
just
them.
extend its concept of the file handle to cache the name from when it was open.
And then the question is, where does it make the most sense to put that functionality? You put it at ZFS side, you leave it at NFS, or you have another layer watching all of this stuff and merging it all together.
So I think, I agree with Alan that the right place is in the operating system. Although I can see that I can see an argument where you might actually want to have the file system, you would want to have ZFS do this, and in particular because that means that you can keep your audit trail with the data that it's about when you move it around, or if you export.
Right, or if you have HA.
I need my snapshot. My snapshot contains the history of that file
Right.
access. If I roll back the snapshot, I still need the original access.
Well, and then you should clone the file system or roll back
Again,
one of them.
Those
Yeah.
are all the
Yep.
workflow
Mhm.
scenarios in an audited environment that we need to maintain.
Yeah.
So yes, it
So
is,
the- yeah.
it is ugly.
There may actually be a better case for doing it in ZFS than I thought, based on the fact that NFS kind of goes around what the operating system already has. We want it to be the same on BSD and Linux. And also ZFS has a bunch of other stuff that we probably should audit in the same way, like all the stuff that goes in ZPL history. Somebody created a snapshot, somebody released a hold, and so on.
Destruction of a snapshot is an
Yeah.
auditable thing.
Yeah.
All of those things tie into the story.
Because, for a while I've thought about, someday ransomware is going to get smart enough to delete snapshots. And so I want releasing a hold to optionally require two-factor authentication. Before we release this hold, you have to, do two-factor so that this snapshot doesn't get deleted unless somebody definitely was allowed to do it. Yeah.
Sounds like that would be like a feature setting to enable some sort of file locking confirmation.
Yeah.
Quick question, at the POSIX level, does ZFS know what a user is and who did what? Or
So ZFS does know, your mic's not on.
I'll repeat the question from the audience, which is me. At the POSIX level, does ZFS know who a user is working on a file, or is it just pushing blocks
Yes.
around as requested by
So
file
ZFS
descriptor or
does, and that's how it does per user quotas,
Quotas,
and things like ZFS user space, where it can instantly calculate for a whole data set how much space each user in that data set is using.
something?
And like if you do ZPL history with the extra flag, I think it's -I for internal, it can actually tell you which user on which host did each of the ZPL history actions. It records that always. It just doesn't always display it because, most of the time you assume it's all this machine, but if you have an HA environment, it could have been the other node. But yeah, the history has a number of drawbacks. I know Delphix added an option to not record all the snapshot creates and destroys in the ZPL history because it would flood out the more important events they actually cared about. But it's still an auditable event, so maybe we need a limited ring buffer of the snapshot creates and destroys and still have the buffer of all the other stuff so that we can have some history, or maybe it's just better that the audit logs keep track of the snapshots creates and destroys and ZPL history is more the other bits. Because,
Snapshot history.
yeah.
Just have something as a different ring buffer.
Speaking of syslog, has anyone seen a close tie of be it the ZPL history to syslog and everything goes over here and we add whatever checks and safeguards
You
we can?
can make the ZFS event daemon or ZFSD record the ZPL history event every time a new history entry gets created.
On Linux?
So, yep, on
And-
Linux or FreeBSD.
Okay.
So
also
in
available.
FreeBSD, you have to add some config to devd so that when it sees the event from ZFS that a new history line's been added, you can log it to syslog. So you can it'd be, a couple of lines of config file to make it log everything to syslog. And, if you have your syslog going shipped off to another machine and archived forever, it would then at least have all of that in it. And not in a ring buffer that's going to get
Exactly,
paged out
my
by
point
people doing
exactly.
other stuff.
Yes. And then you read that back to the data set so that you have it preserved nicely in ZFS.
Yeah, your remote syslog server uses ZFS, obviously, right?
Then bring it back to the host so it's there
Yeah.
and portable with it.
Or, FreeBSD's
Yeah, exactly. You bring it back home to say, oh, here's my log.
Local log and my remote log matches it.
something really interesting that FreeBSD's audit system has is audit distd, which is about sending the audit logs to multiple other machines in a way where we can verify, even if this machine got compromised, we know that the logs that we sent out to 4 other machines, they communally can determine that, no, these logs have not been tampered with.
Do you
But
see much
it
of that in
doesn't
the
create
wild?
the ZFS.
Blockchain logging.
Not quite blockchain, but it predates blockchain and that silliness, but yes.
Do you see people using those audit mechanisms in the wild? And if you sat down a user at the Linux one or the FreeBSD one, would they recognize what they're looking at, or it's a complete retrain on
So
figuring it out?
OpenBSM is a standard that was used by Solaris, Mac, and FreeBSD.
Okay.
only people in regulated industries have I seen actually using it. And it turns out jails complicate things a little bit because we don't allow you to set the username for the audit trail from inside a jail. So a jail can't fake somebody else, but it means that everything done in the jail is attributed to the user who started the jail, which is not necessarily right. So normally when you SSH into a box, SSH can call this system call to say, I'm now this user, and attribute everything that's done in this session to that user. And we don't allow that from inside the jail so that they can't fake somebody, but it means we kind of inherit some state and misattribute everything to somebody who maybe the last person to restart the jail days ago was, the secondary sysadmin. And no, everything that happened in the jail is not their fault. So that's one we're working on fixing right now.
So back to prior art, we have the user space accounting. We have a few things where the user is actually acknowledged and ZFS gets to care. Are there any other prior art examples of ZFS caring about a user at the POSIX level and higher?
Well, just obviously all the VFS stuff and the ownership of a file. On Linux, we have the username munging that you can do for namespaces, so that if you have different like LXD containers, they can have their own set of users that get mapped to a different set of UIDs, but inside the container, they all look like your UID 1001, but to the host, you actually look like you're 1,000,001 or 1,000,001, so that on disk in ZFS, the owner of that file is not just user 1001. It's 1001 in this particular container and not that container. And that way on disk, the files don't show up as being owned by, user 1001 on all my host systems is Alan. But whatever's inside the jail, who knows what that is?
Sure.
And not conflating those UIDs can be helpful. But as far as the auditing system goes, yeah, ZFS doesn't currently have much of anything, and maybe it should. I've also wondered about if it should adopt something kind of like FreeBSD's mandatory access control framework, where the permissions were more flexible. Like ZFS allow is pretty good, but there are maybe more ways it could be expanded. And some things I'd be looking at is like, right now, ZFS destroy is a permission, but there isn't a separate permission for you're allowed to destroy a snapshot, but not a data set, or and so on.
Granular role-based controls.
Yeah, and so most of the ZFS allow covers every ZFS subcommand and every property, but it doesn't cover the fact that some subcommands are overloaded, like destroy.
Oh, destroy.
Is a data set. If you're allowed to, you can say only this data set, but you can't say only the snapshots of this data set.
Does Solaris do any of that stuff with their RBAC?
I don't know. Not that I'm aware of, but I don't have a lot of experience with Solaris. Does Andrew know more about Solaris?
Andrew.
No. He does not know about if RBAC covers any of that.
Greg, while you have the floor, go ahead and unmute.
Anyway, yeah, I just want to flag that as that's what has been preventing us from going full in on it until there's a solid solution for audited and that type of stuff. And I would have to include things like just not SMB and NFS, but if somebody were to SCP to the machine a file or whatever, we'd like to capture that as well. I think that's included in the description of requirements. Yeah, exactly. In case somebody gets on the machine itself. But yeah, I'd be interested to see it, a solution for it. Whilst it's, and I agree that I think it is an OS more than a file system issue. The higher level protocol you should be able to extrapolate that out of them. I think the correlation of them and whatnot is a bit of a thing too. But yeah, we'll see. Like I said, I am very stoked to be able to use a ZFS solution as opposed to something that's, 5 times, 10, 20 times the cost. And the support is the killer part, when you got to pay that. So it's quite steep. But yeah, I think that's really it that I had on that was my big concern. And as a group and a company, that's where we said we can't go forward using this, even though it satisfied our technical requirements and our throughput and our round trip times on NFS calls and whatnot. Everything was great. We even had support. We had Honey Badger cards in it from a company called Liquid. So everything was on NVMe, as far as metadata and cache and logs go. So the system was stellar. Continuously was saturating links to dual 25 gig links to one server. So there was no performance issues there. But it all came down to the auditing, which was a big thing. So that's where we are.
Cool. So we've touched on a few of these topics, but completely orthogonally, but kind of related is metadata traversal performance. We were talking about in the last session about, okay, we can get this information cheaply, this information at a great cost. And someone pointed out that, hey, for example, in libzfs, which we will talk about later, there was some zero recording of ZFS history with BECTL on, I believe, FreeBSD.
It might be worth checking if ZPL history-I as an internal doesn't record those anyway. It just doesn't show up by default to avoid automated actions kind of flooding the log.
Okay.
But yeah, the ZPL history should be creating on the kernel side, and so it shouldn't care whether you did it via libzfs or not.
Got it.
But yeah, so if it's not recorded even in the internal log, then that is a bug and we should fix it.
Sometimes I see on Truna's site, I see logs of ZFS pool and some messages, probably ones generated by libzfs, looks different from everything else. And I have strong feelings that it's almost like voluntary logging things. Like I've done an action and separately logged some log record. And those two don't exactly match each other. So history cannot be exactly trusted. And that's not very good, despite that logs are sometimes corrupted, just syntactically wrong sometimes. But again, if they are not written by kernels, then how can we trust them?
Yeah, for sure.
Is this a documentation question? You should use your OS native auditing, or we do have issues with NFS bypassing it and doing clever things that are opaque to the auditor.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. My biggest question is, what are the other solutions doing? Like, I understand there's the commercial solutions that we can't necessarily know what they're doing, but it feels unlikely that there's no media company that's doing, generic Linux somewhere and somehow meeting these requirements. So what are they doing differently? And maybe it's not easy to get the answer to that, but it does sound like you can probably get some level of what the MPAA requires from Audited or something.
So some of the answer to that also depends on how expensive do you want to make searches of the data. Because, for example, NFSD could simply be made to write a trace of every NFS op that it does, just leave out the actual data. And if you had such a trace, you could reconstruct what it had done, provided you only have to do that, very rarely and not on short notice. Whereas if you need to have something where, okay, the auditor has shown up and I have 3 hours to demonstrate exactly who and when this file was accessed, that potentially requires a lot more work in terms of being able to remember the names through which handles were accessed over time in memory, and then creating appropriate, and in stable storage too, and then creating appropriate audit records in real time that reference the name rather than the handle. I could see how to do it. I have, unfortunately, as part of the course of turning into the storage guy, I spent a lot of time digging in the innards of the NFS code and yelling at Rick Macklem, and it's certainly doable. I think it's the sort of thing where, if you had like a summer of code student who wanted to do that in an NFS implementation, that maybe you could get something that would show you where the holes were that you then needed to pay someone to do a professional implementation for.
Well, and you also have the cost, just straight Samba cost, it's a 60% overhead to turn auditing on to the level that is needed there.
Yeah.
So if we can get that at a lower level, even if ZFS does it and it's 20%, that's still a win.
Have you tried the Samba audit level versus the OS level? Are they feature parity, performance parity? Where any advantages to
The
either?
Samba level is the one that gives the details that you get to.
Okay.
Or that an auditor needs if they're actually looking at it.
Do any of the other SMB implementations have that level of auditing, or purely Samba, to our knowledge?
MoSMB does,
MoSMB?
but it is ugly. It's got some features, but it's something we've tried.
Okay.
I don't know anything else that is.
This is another question where I have to ask, what does the Solaris kernel SMB server do?
Exactly.
I know a guy though.
Yeah, so auditing's implemented in the Vino layer. So what happens is when a session is created, as far as I understand it, an audit context is created which captures certain information about, the user IP and stuff like that. And that's what's used to basically record or generate an audit event. So as far as I know, it's they're standardized. So you get like open, read, stat, and all the general file system kind of POSIX file system operations, and because they have an in-kernel SMB implementation, which is just using the same internal. It's essentially doing it like the read and writes, but like instead of the system call, it's doing it like directly. So yeah, so as far as I know, it handles that fine. And as far as I know, it also works for NFS. Yeah, and SEP or whatever.
Someone mentioned eBPF. Does dtrace help us? Do you magically have a probe that says, everyone did this, here we log it, have a nice day?
Not really. As they were just mentioning, that context that gets created when you log in, that's the thing that FreeBSD jails doesn't let a jail set, because I think at the time it made sense, but I think now, as long as the audit entry says it came from inside that jail, we'd actually rather that it could set who did it. It's just
Interesting.
the username it gives has to be namespaced to the jail, which is not something audit did before, but it has for more years on FreeBSD now. But I don't know that it creates one of these user session contexts when somebody connects over NFS.
It does not.
It does not, and that seems to be the root of the problem, is that we don't have this context of who the user is when it's something that's happening over NFS. And maybe it's something we can look at a little more and see.
Yeah, so So NFS basically passes a Sun RPC version of a struct ucred. So it has credentials. It doesn't have names. Well, in NFS v4, now it does have names, except if you have Linux clients, because they like to send numbers instead of names. But I think you have available to the NFS server all of the data that it would need. It's just a matter of it's really expensive to collect and store and manage this data in the NFS server, and typically most NFS implementations are judged on the basis of performance and not on the basis of how much of your RAM can they take up with audit records.
Yeah, and that's why I'm wondering if maybe this might be like a product future for OpenZFS, because I know in my experience, deal a lot with ransomware hacker and ransomware situations where you get a customer asking you, we had 700 VMs that were deleted. I want to know when they were created, what time they were created, who deleted. And so not necessarily every transaction in the cases of a lot of the customers I deal with is needed, but something like that at the level of file create, file delete, file move operations, which are not as expensive as some of the modify change all the time, but that might be a possibility to consider as a future.
Yeah. So as long as it's tracked, you can tune it up or down. I spoke earlier, the MoSMB with Active Directory and debug mode. That's why it's annoying. So it does collect the data, but it's in a debug status, which is painful to parse.
Whereas with OpenBSM, there's a tool called Audit Reduce that lets you kind of filter down the audit trails to just what you're looking for. And in the work we did 5+ years ago was teaching Audit Reduce to be able to say, I only care about the audit logs from jail number 4 rather than the whole system, and being able to just look at those traces and also just not conflate something that happened in jail 4 with something that happened on the host at the same time, because the user IDs in the jail don't mean the person on the host did it, right? It's a separate user database.
Well, multi-tenant, someone deleted something, could be 10,000 users.
Yes, or user 1001,
Yes.
if you don't specify which container it's in, then that's a different user in every one of those containers.
Any final thoughts? We're at 20 minutes after. And if not, I thank you very much.